Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to WatchBox, and thanks for logging on. We are starting our weekend right, and everything you see on this show is for sale and in stock. Reach out to me, Tim Mosso at thewatchbox.com with your questions about the pricing of these or any WatchBox watches. Reach out to me directly too, because I'm looking to build inventory for the holidays. One watch or an entire collection. We buy, we trade, we sell, and when we buy, we pay cash, we pay fast. No upper limit on value paid. We will buy one watch or your entire collection. To buy, trade, or sell, reach out to Tim Mosso at thewatchbox.com. Okay, I promised you a clash of titans, and here it is. Rolex versus Rolex. We have the 114060 right here, no date sub, ceramic bezel insert, super case, solid end links, solid center links, milled clasp, imposing and impressive, the closest living relative to the original 1953 Submariner. Then we have a watch that ran for only about 3 years, launched in 2014 and discontinued for 2017. This was the last of the 40mm Sea Dwellers, a timepiece 40mm in diameter, yes, and perhaps a bit too subtle, as people didn't see the point in paying a premium for a watch that looked just like a Submariner. These days, we wish we'd bought two of these, one for the wrist and one for the safe to collect. They are both incredible watches. This one is more of a watch you buy to wear. This one's more of a watch you buy to collect. As rare as it is, being a modern stainless steel Rolex dive watch made for only about 3 years, the investment potential here is self-evident. Right here, you have a more numerous timepiece to be sure, as it was made from 2012 to 2020 in the form you see here. And I would say the big determining factor for a lot of folks is going to be price, but also thickness. As you can see, the sub is substantially thinner than the Sea Dweller. The Sea Dweller is deeper diving, and it has the helium escape valve. And because we're not looking at a Submariner with a date, we don't have to compare the wart-like Cyclops eye to the Cyclops-less dial of the Sea Dweller. The nice thing about this watch, it was a watch with a sapphire so thick there was no magnifier on top. Now, that went away with the 50th anniversary Sea Dweller, as Rolex for the first time introduced a Cyclops on a Sea Dweller. Trust me, this is better. Now, popping open the clasp, I should mention these watches are identical internally. Automatic winding, 48-hour power reserve, chronometer certified, anti-magnetic. They're both Calibre 3135. Here you have glide lock, 20mm of incremental adjustment in 2mm increments. What you get on the Sea Dweller, because it is a more deluxe, deeper diving, and ostensibly more professionally oriented timepiece, you open up the clasp, which is very similar in many regards, and you find, yes, glide lock. 20mm of adjustment in 2mm increments, but there's more. There is also flip lock, which is a pull-out extension, the combination of the two giving you over 50mm of total extensible length. So you can use glide lock to fine-tune fit, and you can use flip lock if you really do want to pull this on over some sort of external suit. Throw it on the wrist, it wears nicely, because a lot of the thickness is in the case back, and that sort of nestles into the wrist. On the wrist, it looks a lot like a sub. In fact, it looks a lot like the sub we just saw. And I think the subtlety of this watch recommends it to collectors who are less interested in stature and status and more interested with Rolex history and the unique place this relatively rare watch occupies in Rolex watch history. Taking a quick look at the no-date sub, you can see it's very similar in terms of how it wears. It's really not evident that one of these watches is over 15mm thick and the other one is just over 12. A lot of that is just down to the fact that these case backs, and I will show you, these case backs are dramatically cupped. You could see that there is a large extension from the case back of the Sea Dweller, a little bit less on the Submariner, but it's there. So these watches, in terms of actual case band, are very similar, and they look similar on the wrist. Which one you choose is purely down to your priorities. Do you want an everyday driver or a real investment? Let's do a quick loom shot here. As you can see, in this regard, they are almost identical. Both have ceramic capped bezels, both bezels 120 click and very crisp to actuate. Sticking with Rolex for a moment, but a very different kind of Rolex. This is a watch that debuted at Baselworld 2016. I remember at the time seeing this watch and thinking, yet another year without an all-new Daytona. But within about 36 months, the market was treating this as though it were the latest fashion, because For some reason, the Daytona, now running since 2000 in its current generation, has never been hotter than it is right now, and this reference, 116500LN, is part of the reason the Daytona, despite not being fully redesigned during that period, has now caught fire. The watch is handsome, I'm not going to lie. It's a more attractive case profile than what you get with the so-called super cases. These lugs are blockish, the case is sheer on its side. You don't get any of that with the Daytona. It looks almost more like a dress watch in profile. At 40 millimeters, it wears true to size. It wears 40 millimeters, whereas the 40 millimeter sub and Sea Dweller, they look more like 41s, 42s on the wrist. It is a thin watch, just over 12 millimeters thick. It sits low, and on my 16 centimeter circumference wrist, it wears well. I would call it a unisex option. I do know quite a few women who have worn the 40 millimeter Daytona, and they find it quite agreeable. So if your wrist is smaller, you have a need for a unisex option, perhaps a little greater discretion, a watch that'll fit underneath a sleeve or a cuff, the Daytona is a great option. It's also still a fantastic watch, and while it does seem that the white dial is more numerous, for that reason, I would say the black dial in the long term is going to be a bit more collectible because it doesn't seem like as many people choose the black dial. I like the way the black of the dial runs into the ceramic of the bezel. It creates the appearance of a larger and visually more powerful watch. Nicely loomed dial, inside the case back, Rolex Calibre 4130, 72-hour power reserve, hacking seconds, COSC certified Swiss chronometer, water resistant down to 100 meters. It has a vertical clutch and a column wheel, and that's the tandem you want for the most sophisticated chronograph operation. That said, if you want to pay a lot of money for your chronograph, and I don't mean Rolex money, where a lot of the price you're paying is due to fashion, and the watch's fashion value, no, I'm talking about buying a more expensive watch because the watchmaking is up to par. And in the H. Moser and C Streamliner flyback, what's inside really counts. It's the Agengraph from Agenor. They have a clutch system that combines the best features of a vertical clutch and a lateral clutch to allow the chronograph to start without jump, but also remain engaged. And I'll show you right here. You can see it has the pleasing aesthetics of a lateral clutch chronograph. So you don't get the jump when you start it, and then you don't have to worry about the somewhat unsightly case-back appearance of a vertical clutch chrono. In fact, you could be lulled into believing this is a manual wind watch. In fact, the 54-hour power reserve is energized by a rotor that's underneath the dial. So the movement, which is extraordinarily finished and beautiful, fills the case back up. The watch is 120 meters water resistant. It has a flyback chronograph capability, and you can reset it and restart it with a single push of the trigger up at 10 o'clock. It has radial seconds and radial minutes, so you're actually looking at the minutes register, and of course you can operate it conventionally if you wish. It has a fume dial, funky blue at the center, fading to almost black, navy blue at the edge. It has a racing dial with that staggered seconds track with the individual hash marks, creating the look of a checkered flag. And then, as you can see, it has a sunburst from the center with a lovely metallic grain and no dates, a very, very clean look. You can see there's a ceramic loomed material called globalite that is used on the hands, and the hands are mirror polished. It is very attractive, 42.3 millimeters in diameter, and you can see the bracelet is wonderful, almost organic. The tolerances between the links, best in the industry. The feel is secure and premium, but the look is graceful, and the sensation on the wrist is silken. It's a truly impressive design. Moser never likes to do things the way everyone else does, and out of Schaffhausen, they make about 1,500 watches a year. I like to call them the German-Swiss FP Journe because of their breadth of innovation and relatively low volumes. And you can see that the watch, though it's just over 14 millimeters thick, it's got enough of a slope to its case flank that you can wear it underneath a jacket cuff. And as you can see, it wears quite nicely on my 16 centimeter circumference wrist. This is one of my favorite new watches of 2020. And this is the second version. The first version had a gray dial. I like this better. Speaking of dials to die for, how about this rich, lustrous white lacquer from Zenith? You've got the Zenith El Primero, 36,000 vibration per hour, and we have a white lacquered dial with applique indices, lovely blued hands for the chronograph registers in constant seconds. The timepiece uses the Chronomaster case, which is surprisingly, for a dress-style watch, 100 meters water resistant, so throw this on a NATO or rubber strap and you can take it swimming. The case has a combination of polish and satin, and you can see that the crystal has a dramatic box section profile to evoke a vintage plexiglass tachymeter scale outboard to allow you to gauge the speed of something moving very fast. If you're good with mental decimals, you can neck it down and time things moving more slowly. This could be 50 units or 5 units. Again, you just have to keep your decimals in mind. Roll it over, El Primero Calibre 400, automatic winding, 50-hour power reserve, and a good-looking movement. To be perfectly frank, you can see it has a column wheel with a lateral clutch, and unlike most automatic chronographs, you can see that the column wheel and the lateral clutch are fully visible, giving you the advantages aesthetically that you would get on a manual wind traditional chrono. Very appealing. It does feature a quick set for the date, though not hacking seconds, and it beats away at 36,000 vibrations per hour, as the name implies. 10 beats per second, and back in 1969, the El Primero became a famous first, one of the first automatic chronograph calibers of any kind, but also the first integrated automatic high-beat chronograph ever. Turning the lights off for a moment, you can see that it's actually fairly well loomed. Automatic winding, stainless steel, 100 meters water resistant, and well loomed. It is among the sportiest dress watches that I have encountered. Throw it on the wrist, it's comfortable, but it's large, 42 millimeters, so you probably want a wrist of at least 15 centimeters circumference to wear this one well. I think it wears well on my 16 centimeter circumference wrist. I would rock this. Easy to read too, with black on white printing and hands that produce more contrast than you might expect with high polish on a white base. Really good looking watch. The heart and the soul of traditional Zenith watchmaking from Le Loc, Switzerland. Not from Le Loc, but Geneva. We have the Patek Philippe 5070R. This watch is a lovely example of a model that was made for 4 years. They made about 250 a year, so about 1,000 of these rose gold 5070s exist. The dial is not, strictly speaking, silver. It's somewhere between silver and metallic gray, which gives it a wonderful hefty punch. I've often compared this dial to the Alubeam color used by Mercedes AMG cars, or Avis silver used by Audi and its RS machines. Again, it's just a darker silver with gray metallic undertones. The applique numerals give it a wonderful contrast. The hands are leaf style, and you can see there's a double concentric track outboard, as we have a tachymeter scale and then a 60-second and 60-minute scale. The idea here being to hide the disparity between movement size, if you look at the registers, and case size. This watch, as the 5070J in yellow gold, debuted back at Basel World 1998, and it was based on a vintage aviation watch from the Patek Philippe Museum, the 2512 reference, which was 46 millimeters in diameter. That's where the design of the watch comes from, especially the dial. Back in 1998, though, a 42 millimeter Patek dress watch was considered revolutionary. It was huge by the standards of its day. Now, it's got a nice flat pagoda-style build to the bezel, which I appreciate because it's handsome, layered, and progressive. And then there's a wonderfully intact fluting to these lugs, which one I always check with these 5070s is that the fluting in the lugs and the definition of the case and the bezel remain sharp. You can see on all 4 corners, the definition here remains superb. So condition is absolutely one of the reasons you buy an example of this watch. You buy a well-documented watch with full box and papers and all of the original case definition. You'll also note this is old school case construction, that these lugs would have been made separately and then welded on. That's a very manual way of making a case, old school and rarely seen today. The movement based on the Lemania 2310, as the Omega Calibre 321 it went to the moon. With Patek Philippe, it's known as the CH 2770. You can see it stamped on the base plate below the balance. Patek makes many changes. For one thing, the finish is world-class. Geneva hallmark, and you can see why. I don't need to explain it. We have a column wheel with a lateral clutch, but you can see that the column wheel has been capped for aesthetics and for shock resistance. Instead of a flat hairspring like the original Lemania, we have a handmade overcoil, all of this adjusted in 5 positions, beating away at 18,000 vibrations per hour. Patek also changes the regulator from a mobile stud index to their free-sprung Gyromax style balance, and power reserve increases from the Lemania's 48 to 65 here. And I should mention, the column wheel feel is outstanding. Full deployant clasp and matching rose gold. We'll throw this watch on my wrist. And it's broad and flat. I often shout out the size of this watch when talking about the historical position it occupies. It was a bit of a revolutionary in that regard. But lug to lug, it's very short. It's only about 47 millimeters across the wrist. So even if your wrist is small, 13.5, 14 centimeters in circumference, because the watch isn't wide across the wrist, you're actually going to be able to wear this watch, and it's going to fit well. That said, if you want something even a little bit more compact, just to be sure, launched in 2014, this is the Alango Unzona 1815 Tourbillon. It is 39.5 millimeters in diameter in rose gold, quite slender for what it is. You can see on the reverse side of this watch an extraordinary caliber L102, but we'll start on the dial side. The dial is made of sterling silver, so it's precious metal inside of precious metal. We have fired blue hands, alpha style at center. The center of the hands mirror polished, as is the top of the canyon pinion. You can see the bridge for the tourbillon has been faceted and then also mirror polished, and you can see that mirror polishing as I tilt it through the light. Free sprung with an overcoil hairspring. These are not universal standards at Alango. The use of an overcoil on a Alango watch, as with FP Journe, is rare, exquisite, and special. Now, what does set this watch apart from just about every tourbillon, including FP Journe, is that we have a hacking seconds function. This is extraordinarily rare on a tourbillon. It allows you to set the watch to the second, and it's more than just hacking seconds. It is a zero reset second system that makes it easier to set to the second by always zeroing the seconds hand straight to the index at 60. Now, if you look carefully, you can see that the shape of the tourbillon incorporates elements drawn from historic 20th century German tourbillon craft, so the design of that tourbillon cage is actually drawn from historical precedent. You'll also appreciate that it includes many sharp interior angles which are very difficult to execute. The caliper is beautiful on its reverse side, and you can see it's very traditional Alango watchmaking. German silver bridges and plates. It's a nickel copper zinc alloy, with the copper giving it that golden hue. We have engine turning on the base plate, as well as the structure adjacent to the underside of the tourbillon carriage. The structure bearing the bottom of the carriage has been freehand engraved alongside the engine turning. As you can see, that freehand engraving, very special and distinctive of Alango. All of the wheels feature satination, and then you'll note, although there aren't a whole lot of bridge edges here, they are all mirror finished with a real chamfered anglage. Screw heads are both black polished and blued. We have fired blue screws, as you can see. Some of them hold golden chaton that fix the pivots in place, but when you turn over to the dial side, you can see that we also have black polished screws on this watch. We actually have both types. 3/4 bridge, evocative of pocket watches, and this is a 3-day power reserve. Take note, the underside capstone for the tourbillon carriage is a real brilliant cut diamond. So you get an awful lot when you buy this Alango tourbillon, and I promised you that this watch would be perhaps even more appropriate to a small wrist than the 5070, and that's because at 39.5 millimeters, this is a traditionally sized men's dress complication. Considering the tourbillon, the 3-day power reserve, the innovative zero reset, it is remarkably compact in its dimensions and flat enough to fit underneath a dress cuff. No problem here with that. And you get a full deployant clasp, which is a rare and upscale feature on a Alango watch. This is not universal. Even many of their complications get pin buckles. Okay, talking Moser for a moment. I love Moser, and I have to say, all things considered, Moser is probably the boldest with dial design of any brand in the industry, primarily because they're one of the few brands at any price point that has the confidence to remove their name from the dial, knowing their design is distinctive enough to be recognized anyway. This, in exquisite stainless steel, 42 millimeters, is the Endeavor Perpetual Moon Concept Aventurine. Now, flipping it over, you could see that it is one of 50 made, and my favorite feature is that the case back is curved, and so is the sapphire, to trace and hug the underside of your wrist. There's a little kerf underneath the crown to dig your nail in to pull it out easily. You can see it's got a simple, no-nonsense steel pin buckle and an aventurine glass dial, so on a base of either sterling silver or gold, we have this vitreous glass-based paint that's applied. It's a deep translucent blue, navy blue, with metallic elements added to create the image almost of space. You're looking into the endless cosmos. And then you have the ageless features of enamel, whereby it'll never oxidize, tarnish, or degrade. We have leaf-style hands, faceted to provide a higher contrast. The case is really 41.9 millimeters as I measure it. It has wonderful qualities. As you can see, it's first machined and then hand finished to create these deep hollows. When you're just stamping cases for mass production, you can't do that. The bezel is drawn out broader at 6 and at 12, and then you can see that it's concave all the way around. We do have a moon phase, and it is called Perpetual because it is accurate over 1,027 years, so you set it once and forget it. This moon phase designed for Moser by Andreas Streller, a rock star independent watchmaker of equal status and stature to the likes of Philippe Dufour, Carré Vuillenen, and FP Journe. So he designed this moon phase. 1,500 Moser watches are made a year. They call themselves Moser, and they claim very rare. That's their tagline, and they live up to it. The movement you see here is exceptional. Though rated at 7 days of power reserve, and you can see it as a hidden case-back power reserve indicator, it will actually run for about 9 days. To reduce friction, the escapement's made of 14-karat gold, and that helps to extend the power reserve. It beats away at 18,000 vibrations per hour, very traditional, inspired by Moser pocket watches of the 19th century. The escapement, the balance, the hairspring, all made in-house by Moser's precision engineering subsidiary. And then we have a full balance bridge with a free-sprung index for greater resistance to shock and better timing stability. Now, the nice thing about this escapement and balance structure is that it can be lifted out as a unit, so when this watch goes back for service regionally, wherever you are, the Moser regional service affiliate will pull out this complicated assembly, stick in a pre-serviced unit, and get this watch back to you faster. We have elements from the pocket watch era, including the slow beat rate, the overcoil hairspring, which lets the watch keep equal time in any physical position. We have the 3/4 style bridges. Obviously, they're not a true 3/4. They're split in the center for easy servicing, but it reads as a 3/4. We have the jewel set in chaton, and unlike the blued screws fixing the golden chaton of the Alango, here we have black polished screws, and you'll note a distinctive Moser double-crested Côte de Genève, something that's very handsome. Throwing the watch on the wrist, it's large for a dress watch, but it's not huge for a dress watch, and I could probably recommend it for a wrist as small as 15 centimeters in circumference. It'll look real good on a wrist of that size or larger. It's got a lot of substance to it, and again, I think Moser watches give you maximum style and substance without the hype. This is, if anything, a little bit of an underrated independent right now. But sometimes Moser gets a little help from its friends, and they don't come much better than MB&F. For years, Moser, through that subsidiary, Precision Engineering, has been supplying hairsprings to MB&F. They've been one of Max's friends. For 2020, this watch launched. It is the Endeavour Cylindrical Tourbillon, 42 millimeters in steel, a collaboration between Moser and MB&F, and it is a 15-piece limited edition with this fumé fade burgundy dial. You can see it has a sapphire dial as well, and it is a lovely loomed dial right down to the Moser logo. Now, what you're getting here is the dial layout, that vintage sort of what-if watch, what if a wristwatch were made in the 1890s, that the Legacy machine asks. The Legacy machine queries what would happen if Jules Verne wore a wristwatch, and MB&F made that watch. So the Legacy machine, which launched in 2011, gives you a very vintage aesthetic on the dial side. It also gives you a large domed sapphire over the works, whereas the Endeavour case, which you saw previously, has these sculpted hollows. Combine the Legacy machine dial and crystal with the Endeavour case and Moser's running gear, and you wind up with a spectacular watch. As you can see, automatic winding, 3-day power reserve, 15 pieces made in stainless steel, and then there's the star of the show, which is the flying tourbillon. But it's not just a flying tourbillon. You can see how tall it is, that to accommodate a cylindrical hairspring, just as you'd find on vintage marine chronometers. It is a wonderfully three-dimensional affair with 2 terminal curves to help center its mass perfectly. The idea behind the cylindrical hairspring is it's even better than a flat-ish overcoil, because in addition to the height imparted by the actual curves, you have the stacked rings of the hairspring, the result being an almost perfectly centered mass. So in any physical position, that hairspring will breathe concentrically. It's a 1-minute tourbillon, beats away at 21,600 vibrations per hour, and it is a flying tourbillon that has no upper bridge to block your view of the works. It's free sprung, adjusted in 6 positions, handsomely hand decorated, and very appealing. I'll throw this watch on the wrist, and you may be wondering, how thick is it? It's actually about 19 millimeters thick, and short of a Corum Bubble or a Rolex Deep Sea Special from the 50s or 60s, you're never going to find a more dramatically cambered sapphire or a more dramatic watch. And this watch is a GPHG laureate, as it won the Audacity Prize at the GPHG in 2020, a very special collaboration between Moser and MB&F. Let's say you like this idea of a stainless steel high horology watch, but you want to seek absolute value. Well, you're going to have trouble finding value in a steel watch from F.P. Journe, because those are rare and exceptionally expensive. You're also going to find that from the likes of Moser, you pay something approaching true value. They're not underpriced or overpriced, even if the brand is a little bit underrated. But with Chopard and the Louis Ulysse Chopard series, all of a sudden you can get that Vacheron, that Patek, that Journe level of watchmaking, and you can do it with a real price first, value first outlook. This, a 250-piece limited edition in stainless steel, is the Chopard Louis Ulysse Chopard Tech Regulator. It is a regulator with a 9-day power reserve, a second time zone, 39.5 millimeter steel case. You can see how this works. We have a regulator dial with hours, minutes, and seconds, a radial track in nickel anthracite with applique rhodium plated Arabic numerals. You can see that we have at the top of the dial a power reserve that appears to go to 8. In fact, it's 9 days of power reserve, and then a little scale in 24-hour format that allows you to set your second time zone. There's a little pusher on the side of the case that allows you to make that adjustment. Now, the watch is a manual wind. You can see it uses a caliber that it describes as 4RT. In fact, this is a version of the caliber 198. And the regulator movement has been around since 2004, but I believe this limited edition was issued in 2008. You can see it is the Quattro movement base with 1, 2, 3, 4, 2 sets of stacked barrels, so 4 mainspring barrels overall. You can see it is beautifully finished. It's got a fixed buckle, whereby there's a screw fixing the 2 sides together, but I'm going to turn it inside out so you can better see it. Micro Côte de Genève, very narrow and beautifully gradiated, light to dark from side to side, handsomely applied. You can see the anglage is mirrored, and from this angle you can see quite beautiful. All of the screw heads have been smoothed. Some of the screws, as you can see on the regulator assembly, are black polished. Others are fired blue. We have satination on the wheels, and then we have a little bit of engine turning on the base plate. The anglage in particular is a highlight, as every bridge is beautifully beveled. Awesome, with every refinement you can imagine. From a COSC chronometer certification, to a handmade Breguet overcoil hairspring, to a stop seconds function to set it precisely. And then you can see that because this is the tech model of the regulator, it's a little bit more mechanically driven, and it brings the engineering up to the surface for your appreciation. As you can see, the wheels driving the second time zone, the motion works at center, as well as the different displays on the dial. When you throw this watch on the wrist, it's quite special. It's not excessively large, and at under 40 millimeters, there's a democratization of complication and luxury here, so just about anyone can wear this watch. And again, at the price you'll pay for a manufacturer movement high complication chronometer from Chopard, you're going to be getting something that is effectively Patek level watchmaking for a Rolex retail price. A very impressive watch in every regard, and a super underrated sub-brand. Louis Ulysse Chopard is as good as anything in the industry. Jumping over to Audemars Piguet, we have not one but 2 Royal Oaks. We're in the last year of the 15202, so the Jumbo, reference 15202, which has run since 2000 and which was extensively redesigned in 2012, well, it's being phased out after 2021. This is a lovely monoblock case, 15202 OR, Or Rouge, or red gold, and it's one of the best combinations, as we have the relatively exclusive and rare blue galvanized petite tapisserie dial inside a case that is deeply red with rose gold, all hand finished. Just to make the bracelet alone, not to make it, but to hand finish it, takes 9 to 11 hours. That's before we hand finished the bezel and the case. Everything here is as crisp as the day it left Les Brassus. Refinishing? No. Tolerances in the bracelet? Wonderful. Factory. Crisp. Tight. The dial? Lovely. It's lush. It is pantograph cut, which means, unlike, for example, the Royal Oak Offshore, which has a stamped dial, this was cut by a 19th century mimicry engine, and since 2012 that's been done in-house at Audemars Piguet. You can see the bezel has that rounded octagon form, originally launched in 1972, inspired by a vintage diving helmet. When Gerald Genta designed this watch, he designed it with steel in mind, but every once in a while we get an exquisite treat in the form of a full precious metal jumbo, and that's what we have here. The bolts, which contrast with the red gold, or rose I should say, properly speaking, it is 4N. The bolts are white gold and hexagonal, and because they are bolts and there's a nut on the back side of them holding them in place, they can actually be aligned to circle the dial. We have a crown that is also hexagonal, like the bolts. There's a little bit of design parallelism there, one echoing the other. And on the reverse side, A movement originally designed by JLC for Patek Vacheron and Audemars Piguet. Today, Audemars Piguet makes the Calibre 2121 in-house, and it has for a few decades now, but it features all of its traditional assets, including super thin construction and automatic winding. There's this beryllium ring that runs all the way around, and there is actually a little jewel bearing here and here and here and here under this beryllium ring, which runs all the way around. The weighted rotor only sits on half the ring. So by having the rotor sunken so close to the bridges, you thin out the base movement, which is just 2.4 millimeters thick. And by fitting those rollers, you ensure that the ring and the mass will never come into contact with the bridges or the plates. The standard of finishing on this movement, you can really see it from the beveling work on the edge of the bridges. It is higher than you'll get in a standard Royal Oak or an offshore, and it is extensively manually finished to a degree that no standard Audemars Piguet is, which is one of the reasons they make so few of this model. In about mid-2017, AP phased out the monoblock cases and began building the 15202 the way Patek builds a Nautilus, with a bezel, a mid-case, and a case back. Well, this watch is built the way Gerald Genta designed the original, with the case back and the mid-case all one piece. It is a monoblock case and one of the very last of them. Automatic winding with a 40-hour power reserve. The watch itself is only 8.2 millimeters thick and 39 millimeters in diameter, and you can see it wears quite well on my wrist. Super slim. In rose gold, it's definitely a little bit dressier than in steel, but it also makes a bigger aesthetic statement. If you're looking for something that packs just a brass-knuckled punch, visually, this thing is 1,000 watts on your wrist and beautifully made inside and out. Now, if you want a more durable, everyday Royal Oak, you'd be interested in the 2019 to present 15500 ST. This launched in 2019 as the new mainstream Royal Oak, using the 41mm case size that arrived in 2012. This is the one that's designed to be used every day, the one that's safe to swim with, the one that has a more durable movement, a more rugged bracelet, and a more substantial clasp. This clasp, a twin-trigger double deployant, is rugged enough to be featured on an offshore, and the same is true of the bracelet. While the bracelet and the case and the bezel take the same amount of time and skill to finish as the gold, these are also less likely to scratch and show wear, so it's a bit more durable for use on the wrist. You can also feel that the links of the bracelet holding the works together are joined with a solidity that you don't find in the dress watch like Jumbo. We also have a pantograph cut dial here, but this is the Grande Tapisserie. You have the Grand and you have the Petit. Petit, small hobnail. Grand, large hobnail. Gray galvanized. This is a sharp grayscale look that is cool on the wrist, not quite as intense as the black and not quite as boutique as the blue. It's a bit tougher, stronger, and more forceful than the silver. On the reverse side, you can see this watch featuring the Calibre 4302 that arrived in 2019. You remember it that year as it was part of the Code 1159 collection. What makes that movement better than the previous 3120 is that the new movement that you just saw is bigger and better fills the case back. It has a higher beat rate for potentially better accuracy at 28.8 versus the other watches 21.6. The new movement also has 10 extra hours of power reserve at 70 rather than 60. The watch has a screw-down crown and 50 meters water resistance, which means it's surface swimmable, and it is quite well loomed. As you can see, it's an easy watch to read at night. It's also a big watch. It reads, frankly, more like a 43 millimeter on the wrist, and I would even say that's how it wears. It wears like a 42 or a 43. When you shop for Royal Oaks, size down a little bit from what you would normally wear, because they all wear large, and with the integrated bracelets, they wear just a bit larger. This is a timepiece that you could wear every day. Mechanically, physically, it's quite durable. Water resistance is good, power reserve is excellent, lume is more than sufficient. This is the Royal Oak to buy and wear every day. Sticking with Moser for a sec, this is one of their best references. Now, they don't have a huge history of pilot watches, which is why they call this the Heritage Center Second. You can use your imagination to fill in the blanks, and you can reason that this watch is drawn from the pilot's watch imagery of the 1920s and 30s, when a lot of watches were actually pocket watches with lugs welded on for that wire lug look. Now, of course, these aren't built in that fashion, but they do have the evocative form of 1930s converted pocket watch pilot's watches. You have this large vintage style crown with a sharp knurling. You have a round case with wire style lugs because it's a Moser. We do have case side texture and hollows. And then we have a dial with broadsword style hands that are segmented in cathedral fashion, a lollipop counterweighted needle seconds hand, and then we have a lovely vintage style railroad track seconds and minutes outboard with another vintage inspired set of Arabic numerals, which are actually three-dimensional blocks of lume. You can see they stand proud of the dial. We'll do a lume shot here real quick, and you can see how three-dimensional those blocks of lume really are. An easy watch to view in the dark. It's 42 millimeters in stainless steel, and it has the Fume fade dial we saw on the flyback before. So funky blue at center, navy blue at the edge, and a fade from one to the other with a metallic sunburst. Minimal branding. You can see it doesn't even say Swiss made on the dial because Moser stresses that it goes above and beyond the Swiss made standard of 60% Swiss content. Moser is 95 to 100 on its watches. Flip it over, and you can see it has an automatic winding caliber, 3-day power reserve, stop seconds or hacking, manufacturer movement with manufacturer hairspring balance and escapement, full balance bridge with a free sprung index to make it shock tolerant. So you have that 3-day automatic winding power reserve with a rugged bidirectional pawl-based magic lever winding system. Lots to love here. We have an aviation style calfskin strap with a contrasting stitch. Give it the authentically vintage look, and it's low enough on the wrist that you could use it as a dress watch. I'd recommend it for a wrist of 14 centimeters circumference or larger, and it is one of the best looking pilot's watches you'll find. You also pay far less for this than you will for the basically similar Patek Philippe 5522A. So this is a fantastic way to get into independent brand watchmaking without making any sacrifices in functionality or durability. Speaking of independent brand watchmaking, this one is a prince. Now, what at first glance appears to be an F.P. Journe Octo Calandrier boutique edition actually predates the boutique line by 3 model years. This was a custom order for Sincere, one of the premier watch vendors in East Asia. Sincere often orders special editions, piece unique, and limited runs, and this watch was a special order for Sincere, combining the rose gold case and a black dial. You can also see that there's a break between the use of blued hands for telling the time and a polished hand for the retrograde date scale. It is an annual calendar, meaning it only needs to be adjusted once during the jump from February to March, and it uses a quick set system that allows you to change the date and the day, or if you wish, you can just change the day. It is a retrograde annual calendar, and then you flip it over, and it's Octo Calibre 1300. Rose gold with a rose gold rotor. It's got a 120-hour chronometric, 160-hour absolute power reserve, 21.6 beat rate, 5-position adjustment, just like a chronometer would be, and then it's free sprung for durability with an enormous balance that has a huge amount of inertia for better timekeeping. So this watch is extraordinarily rare. A boutique edition, before the boutique edition existed, it has the 38mm discontinued case. The case was discontinued in 2015 at 38mm. The model, the Calandrier, was discontinued after 2014, and then the only way to get this look, black dial and rose gold case, after 2009 was to buy through the boutique. Also worth mentioning, this is one of the French-made Eleanor cases. As you can see, Eleanor's maker's mark, as well as the French hallmarks, and then you can see the Swiss hallmark right there. The double hallmarking is because these cases were made by Eleanor outside of Paris for F.P. Journe, and those cases were used on Journe watches up until about mid-2008. So this watch features so many parallel threads of discontinued F.P. Journe history, a fantastic way to get into collectible Journe with an everyday friendly complication. Back in 2006, Maserati celebrated its 90th anniversary, and the Maserati brothers would be proud if they saw the machine they'd inspired. Nope, not a car, but a watch named after a car. This is the Audemars Piguet Millenary Maserati MC12 limited edition. It is a tourbillon, it is a power reserve, it is a chronograph. It has 237 hours of manual wind power reserve, and you can see the barrels on the dial side. Caliber 2884 with a 1-minute tourbillon, free sprung, adjusted in 5 positions with an overcoil hairspring made by hand. You can see the Maserati Trident. Maserati's signature corporate blue color decorates much of the movement. You have automotive style calibration outboard, and you do have a tachymeter, but you also have a power reserve indicator, and this traces that manual wind power reserve. The watch features a unique bullhead style chronograph operation that makes it easier to operate when it's on the wrist, as you can use your thumb and your forefinger. It has a wonderful combination of complications, and surprisingly, for a watch in this style, it's actually loomed. Now, the timepiece is 47 millimeters wide, and it's 49 millimeters from lug to lug. It is a 150-piece limited edition, but despite being a King Kong complication, it's actually fairly easy to wear on a smaller wrist. If your wrist is 15 centimeters circumference or larger, you can wear it. You'll definitely feel where the money went with all that platinum, but the timepiece is ergonomically sound, like all millenary models are. The movement made by Audemars Piguet Renault Papy is ultra haute de gamme and immaculately hand-finished, and it was AP's first use of carbon fiber on structural components of movements. As you can see, some of the bridges and the plate underneath are actually made of unidirectional weave carbon fiber. So this is a technically impressive watch, hand-finished, handmade, hand-regulated, and as you can see, it has a wonderful column wheel lateral clutch chronograph on the reverse side with the bridges for the chronograph system in that signature Maserati blue, and you can actually see that some of the drive bridges are also in blue, driving the tourbillon underneath. Beautifully made, very rare. This is the Audemars Piguet that I love. I'm not into the sports watches, and I'm not a huge Royal Oak fan, but watches like this get me thrilled about the AP brand, and they're wonderful value compared to what you would pay to get something like this from Patek Philippe, FP Journe, or Grubel 4C. Speaking of which, it's hard for me not to end the show with a Grubel 4C. And this one gets pride of place over the AP because this is no mean Grubel. Not that there is one, but we're talking about the first Grubel 4C model launched for the 2005 model year in late 2004. The first fundamental innovation from Robert Grubel of France and Stephen 4C of Britain. The watch is 43 millimeters in white gold. It is the double tourbillon 30 degree. So you have one tourbillon. You see this four-spoke scrolling seconds display. That is a 4-minute tourbillon on the outside. Now, if you look inside, you can see canted at a 30-degree angle, there is a second tourbillon that moves in 1-minute circuits. So you have the double tourbillon. The inner one is 30-degree angled, so even when it's sitting on your dresser at night, that one balance is turning with an angle with respect to gravity, allowing gravity to even out its timing effects on the movement, running fast, running slow, canceling out the effects of the hairspring's asymmetrical center of gravity. This is a rare tourbillon that does what a pocket watch tourbillon does, namely improve the regularity and precision of the watch, and that is very special. We have a continuously black polished specular finished bridge for the tourbillon. The tourbillon carriage itself is also black polished. We have both fired blue and black polished screws. You can see that the edge of even the dial has been beveled, and the bridges are nickel copper zinc, or Maisure, that German silver material we see on Alango, but here they've been gold gilded. You can see the jewels are in chaton, a nod to the pocket watch era of watchmaking in Le Chaux de Fonds, where Grubel 4C is based. The watch has a power reserve indicator on the dial side, and the track from 72 to 0 is made of white gold. The hands are fire blued, the cannon pinion at center is mirror polished, and you can see on the reverse side the ungulage here is a mile-wide, glossy gleaming, and the bottom of the tourbillon assembly has been finished to the same standard as the top. We have a jewel set in a golden chaton, fixed by screws at center, and you can see the tracks on which the 1-minute and 4-minute tourbillon are running. We have two mainspring barrels that are beautifully satinated, and you can see that the interior of the wheels feature chamfered spokes and chamfered inner circumference. The base plate has a concentric brushed satin graining across its surface, though immediately underneath the driving wheel for the tourbillon carriage, you can see there's also engine-turned perlage, and the bridges have been frosted using a wire brush. This is one of the most historically significant independent brand watches of all time. The first innovation from a company that would come to define the independent space. It is highly collectible, and at 43 millimeters, it's actually one of the most wearable Grubel 4C models, as I can wear it just fine. I adore this watch, and yes, I desire it, and I rarely say that about the watches I share with you here on the show. You can see the case is a nod and a wink, an acknowledgement of the frequency of the balance. We have this sine wave that runs all the way around the case, and you can see that the lugs, which are mirror polished, I'll take my fingerprints off, but the lugs are concave in profile and welded on for attachment. So this case is as immaculately hand finished as the movement, and this is a rare Grubel 4C that gives you everything. refinement, technical sophistication, fine finish, historical importance, and most importantly, it is wearable on a smaller wrist. Reach out to T Mosso at thewatchbox.com for purchase and pricing details.